It's great to be joined today by Carl Zimmer, who's a columnist for the New York Times, also author most recently of She Has Her Mother's Laugh, The Power, Perversions, and Potential of Heredity. Carl, it's so great to talk to you. You know, we've been following the development of genetic editing technology, CRISPR. We've had medical ethicists on the program to discuss the issue. I guess to kind of get us started in this conversation, has the discussion around genetic editing in humans changed fundamentally over the last 5, 10, or 15 years as a result of the technology that has advanced? Or is the debate and controversy around it basically the same one that's been around for a couple of decades?
I think that the debate is getting more realistic in the sense that people are actually able to point to particular kinds of technologies and say, we could actually use this and make particular changes to the human genome. Before, a lot of it was quite hypothetical, almost science fiction, but now, there are experiments going on where scientists appear to be able to make precise changes to human embryos. They can do it. So the debate has gotten more realistic. It's also gotten more urgent because this is going to happen quickly.
One of the, I guess I'd call it an argument or talking points that you will often read in opposition to this type of technology is that it's going to lead to rich people being able to afford designer babies. It could lead to even a larger gap in terms of wealth and income over the long term because you're going to have rich people who are going to be able to, et cetera, et cetera. I think you understand the argument. Is that the actual concern that should be debated, or is that sort of a false debate in your mind?
I think that it's not really getting at the heart of the technology in terms of a debate. That is really a question about uh, how we hand out medical services, really. I mean, what if we lived in a country where anybody could use CRISPR on their child, say through some kind of socialized medicine system? Um, Suddenly that debate goes away. But, I don't think that people would say, oh, okay, it's all settled then. I think there are more fundamental issues about CRISPR that really feel, deeply uncomfortable to a lot of people. Just the mere fact of being able to change the future of heredity. And, we should explore that. Why is that so unsettling to us? And are we right to feel that way? Or maybe we should just learn to like it.
One of the primary ways that Arthur Kaplan sort of said or suggested that we should divide genetic edits into categories was the type that would persist to the children of those who have had the modifications done and those that would not. In other words, those that would not be passed along. In your mind, is that a reasonable way to sort of categorize the types of edits that could conceivably be done?
I think that's a good first pass, because I mean, the fact is that scientists have been developing ways to treat genetic disorders for decades. And we're really on the verge of starting to have really effective treatments that actually change the genes themselves. But we're talking here about, a person who is born with a disease and then at some point later they get a treatment. So maybe in the future, people could get, say, a treatment for hemophilia, where you either insert a working copy of that blood clotting gene into their cells, or maybe you go in with gene editing technology like CRISPR and you change it. Um, but they won't pass that down to the next generation. Um, if you change the embryo and fix that change, then you are talking about things that are going to be inherited in the next generation. And so if there's any concerns about safety, it's not just that one patient you're thinking about. You have to think about the person who inherits those genes from that patient.
One of the things I think about in this discussion, but really in any discussion about technology, is that the argument that the technology could be misused or used in ways that would not be in line to maybe maximize well-being or whatever standard you want to apply to it, That type of argument has sort of also been around, right? I mean, if you go back to like a crude example where the automobile became something that was clearly on the horizon, there was the argument made that it would have this bad side effect of the horse buggy drivers are going to lose their job. And obviously, when we get more distance from that a fork in the road, so to speak, we realize it was silly to ever think that that was going to be an argument to hold back the development of the car. Are you swayed in general by arguments about how a technology could be misused, or is that just inherent to anything that humans develop?
You, you know, it's interesting. You talk about the car. I mean, we do laugh about the plight of the horse buggy whip maker, and that seems kind of laughable. On the other hand, cars have been a major source of pollution that has, cut a lot of lives short, honestly, with particulate matter, and are major emitters of greenhouse gases. And those were things that I don't think really anybody really thought about initially, and then it only really became clear after that technology was really locked in. I mean, we depend on cars, and unless you're Amish, going back to a carriage isn't really an option. So there, I think there are always going to be these sort of unknown unknowns when it comes to technology, and I think we have to be mindful of that, and we have to be sort of monitoring these things as we go along. I don't think that we should stop, exploration of technology. Vaccines, antibiotics, and so on. I mean, all these things have helped to make the world a much better place. But on the other hand, we have to bear in mind that there might be something wrong with something we're inventing now that we may not realize till much later. And when you're talking about, the human gene pool, that's pretty serious stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if there's a lesson to be taken from the horse buggy car example, it's that we likely won't know the real challenges to contend with until much later. The ones that we think are going to be the main ones end up actually not being the primary concerns.
Yeah, and it doesn't help in this regard that we humans live a pretty long time, and so what if there are issues with CRISPR and heredity that don't really show up until the next generation or the generation after that? Are you going to wait 40, 50, 80 years to really get a clear sense of how safe things are? It's particularly tricky for humans, but then again, like we can't just say, well, we can't do any medical research for fear that something bad might happen.
There is a connection between CRISPR and genetically modified foods, which is something we've talked about on the program for a long time. I've interviewed George Church here in Boston at Harvard University about the topic. I have sort of catalyzed some anger from many in my audience, a predominantly progressive left-wing audience, because I've taken the position, which I believe is based in science, that there is no evidence that genetically modified foods are harmful to human health on the basis merely of their genetic modification. That if you combine GMOs with harmful pesticides, then yes, those GMOs could be damaging to human health, but because of the pesticides, not because of their genetically modified nature in and of itself. This is something that's connected to the work that you've done. Do you have a strong position generally on the safety of genetically modified foods, specifically on the basis of their being genetically modified?
Well, I think that it's important to bear in mind that every time somebody produces a new batch of seeds, there are some new mutations in them, and that the whole history of domestication has involved you taking advantage of mutations and favoring some over others and combining them through breeding and so on. Now, that being said, nobody ever crossed a corn stalk with a strawberry, so there certainly are limits to that kind of breeding. But on the other hand, if you're concerned about taking genes from one species and putting them into another, then CRISPR is the solution to your problems, really, because CRISPR is basically snipping out small pieces of DNA or changing, like a single letter to a new one in the DNA. It's not putting in these huge changes, and so and in fact, in terms of like new mutations that may arise by accident with this process, it's no more than what you get through regular breeding.
The one element of this debate that I see come up time and again is that you will see some detractors of GMO foods say things like, "We don't know if it's safe because it hasn't been studied because big agriculture doesn't allow it to be studied." In my research, that seems to be patently untrue. In other words, that while big agriculture may not be funding those studies, or at least the unbiased studies that we would hope to see, that the academic world has actually been studying GMO food for a long time, and there seem to be countless studies about it.
Oh, sure, of course. I mean, go to Cornell University, go to University of Minnesota, go to University of California, Davis. You'll find tons of research on this. I mean, in my book, She Has Her Mother's Laugh, I went to Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory and spent time with a scientist there who is using CRISPR to try to produce tomatoes that can grow further north, and by extending their growing season. And it's all he is doing is he's snipping out small chunks of DNA that are involved in controlling when they flower. So yeah, I mean it's not something that is being CRISPR is not something that's being hidden in some corporate lab. Now but I don't want to make it sound like everything is totally perfect in advance.
Sure.
I mean we do have an issue right now with herbicides, as you mentioned. I mean, the one of the main herbicides that is being used with these GM crops is starting to become useless because evolution has basically bred resistant weeds. That happened before with regular pesticides and regular crops. Now it's happening again. And so now some of the big companies are moving to another herbicide, that dicamba, which is a lot of scientists have a lot of serious concerns about the use of it. So, the GMOs, I don't see them as being some kind of monster, but they're certainly not a panacea. And if GM crops mean that we end up using some herbicides that are of serious health concerns, then that's not really a great solution.
We've been speaking with Carl Zimmer, who's a columnist for the New York Times, most recently author of She Has Her Mother's Laugh, The Power, Perversions, and Potential of Heredity, which I highly recommend. Carl, really a pleasure speaking with you today.
Thanks so much for having me. Take care.